The quiet of the vast Pacific Ocean is absolute. On an outrigger canoe, many thousands of years ago, the only sounds you would hear are the rhythmic splash of a paddle, the creak of woven ropes, and the subtle groan of the wood hull against the steady push of the swell. It is not the dramatic, high-stakes journey often portrayed in films, but a slow, methodical, and profoundly serene act of navigation, an intricate dance with the elements, performed with an intimate knowledge of the world around you. This is the world of the Polynesian voyagers, a people who, without a compass, sextant, or even a map as we know it, traversed a third of the Earth's surface. They settled every major habitable island from New Zealand to Easter Island, and from Hawaii to Tahiti. In a span of a few thousand years, the foundation of their incredible feat lay not in a single piece of technology, but in an exhaustive and highly specific body of knowledge passed down through generations. To a modern observer, their tools seem almost non-existent. There was no iron, no precise chronometer. Their most advanced navigational tool was a stick chart, a seemingly simple arrangement of shells and sticks. Yet, this humble object was an abstract, three-dimensional map, representing the complex patterns of ocean swells, a system of subtle forces that are invisible to the untrained eye. It was not a chart to be used on the water, but a memory aid, a teaching tool used on land to instill the deep understanding needed to navigate. The journey began long before the canoe ever left the lagoon. It began with the quiet, continuous observation of the stars. The Polynesians were master astronomers, but not in the way of building grand observatories. Their observatory was the sky itself, a vast, ever-changing map above them. They had a system of directional stars, known as the star compass. It was not a physical object, but a mental construct, a 32-point compass where each point corresponded to a specific star rising or setting on the horizon. They didn't just know the stars by name. They knew their exact rising and setting points. Throughout the year, the rising of certain stars, like Herculia, Arcturus, was particularly important. Herculia, with its distinctive orange glow, was the zenith star for the Hawaiian Islands. Its position directly overhead told navigators they were in the correct latitude. But it wasn't enough to know the stars. The sky was not just a compass. It was a clock and a calendar too. The position of the sun at different times of the day and its location, relative to the stars at dawn and dusk, were all part of this grand celestial tapestry. The navigators, called Kahuna Ho'okel in Hawaiian, underwent a long and arduous apprenticeship. It was not a test of memorization, but of assimilation. They lived, breathed, and slept the knowledge. They were trained to see the world differently, to perceive the ocean as a living entity with its own subtle language. The wind, for instance, was not just a force to be felt. It was a constant, directional guide. The navigators memorized the direction of the prevailing trade winds and the subtle shifts that signaled a change in weather or the proximity of land. They also learned to interpret the clouds. Certain types of clouds, especially small, stationary ones, often form over land, even when the land itself is still well below the horizon. The undersides of clouds would sometimes be tinged green from the reflected light of a lagoon or a large island, a signal that was invisible to the uninitiated. But perhaps the most profound and difficult skill to master was the reading of the ocean swell. The ocean, even on the calmest day, is in constant motion, and this motion is not random. It is a symphony of intersecting swells, each one originating from a distant storm system. A trained navigator could feel these swells, even in their sleep, and could identify their direction and strength. As a canoe traveled, the navigator would feel the primary swell, the one coming from a known direction, and then the secondary swells, and so on. As a canoe approached an island, the primary swells would be reflected off the landmass, creating a unique pattern of intersecting waves. The navigator could feel this subtle change, the way a person might feel a change in air pressure before a storm. They would lie on the floor of the canoe, their back against the hull, to better sense the subtle vibrations and movements of the water. These navigators were not just sailors. They were master ecologists. They knew that the presence of certain birds, like the white tern or the frigate bird, could indicate the proximity of land. White terns, for instance, never stray more than a few hundred miles from land. The frigate bird is a land-based hunter, and its flight path from a high altitude can point directly to its home island. The type of marine life they encountered was also a clue. The color of the water, the presence of certain types of seaweed or debris, even the smell of the air, a subtle scent of damp earth or vegetation, all contributed to the composite picture of their location and direction. This system of navigation was a testament to human observation and memory, a profound connection between the mind and the natural world. It was a form of knowledge that could not be written down. It had to be felt, experienced, and lived. It was a history passed down not in books, but in the calloused hands and knowing eyes of a few chosen individuals. Their voyages were not reckless leaps into the unknown, but quiet, confident steps across a watery landscape that they understood as intimately as we understand the streets of our own hometown. Yet, for all their knowledge, the challenges were immense. A sudden storm could erase days of progress and scramble their celestial compass. The vastness of the Pacific was unforgiving. It was a world where a single miscalculation or a moment of inattention could mean the complete loss of a canoe, its crew, and its cargo. How could a people so reliant on the stars and the swells navigate through the very real possibility of a week-long blanket of clouds? The problem of an overcast sky was a constant, terrifying possibility for the Polynesian navigator. For a people whose entire world was mapped by the celestial sphere, the loss of the stars was like being struck blind. But the Awo, or navigator, was not so easily defeated. Their system was a brilliant redundancy, a layered set of observations that, when one failed, others could take its place. When the stars vanished behind a curtain of clouds, the navigator would turn their focus from the heavens to the subtle, living currents of the ocean itself. This was a practice known as wayfinding, and it relied on a deep-seated, intuitive knowledge of the sea. It wasn't just a matter of reading the swells. It was a matter of feeling them. The voyagers had a sophisticated mental model of the ocean. They knew that the dominant swells, the great rolling hills of the ocean's surface, emanated from predictable sources: the steady trade winds from the east and the prevailing swells from the north and south. These were the primary roads of the ocean. As a navigator sailed, they would feel the canoe's hull rise and fall with these primary swells, and they would correct their course to stay true to their intended direction. But a storm, even a distant one, would introduce a new, often disorienting swell. A skilled navigator could feel this new wave pattern and mentally subtract it from the known patterns, allowing them to remain oriented. This was not a conscious mathematical calculation. It was a physical, almost subconscious feeling. The navigator would often lie down in the canoe, or at least sit with their back to the direction of travel, to better feel the subtle, rocking motion of the hull. They were, in a sense, using their entire body as a finely tuned sensor. The ocean itself had other clues. The temperature of the water could change subtly as the canoe entered a new current, or approached the cooler waters around an island. The color of the water also provided a continuous stream of information. The deep, dark blue of the open ocean would gradually lighten to a lighter blue or green as the depth decreased. The presence of a coral reef, even one far below the surface, could create a change in the water's hue. The navigators learned to read these slight variations as a modern person might read a change in the color of a traffic light. But perhaps the most fascinating and quiet clues were the signs of life. The ocean is full of life, and the navigators knew which creatures were harbingers of land. The Iwa or frigate bird was a particularly important sign. These birds are strong flyers but cannot rest on water. They must return to land at night. A navigator spotting an Iwa late in the afternoon, flying in a steady, determined path, could confidently infer that land was in that direction. Other seabirds, like boobies and petrels, also had their own specific flight patterns and habits. A navigator could tell the difference between a bird that was just passing through and one that was on its way home. The navigators also used the natural ecosystem as a map. They would look for floating debris, especially the presence of certain kinds of wood or vegetation that only grew on specific islands. They even learned to read the clouds not just for their color or shape, but for the presence of certain reflected lights. A cloud's underside might have a greenish hue from a shallow lagoon, or a white, almost glowing tint from the light reflecting off a white sandy beach. These skills were not a matter of a single brilliant insight, but the accumulation of 1,000 quiet observations. It was the result of a culture where observation and patience were paramount. They were not just sailing to an island. They were sailing to a known, although distant place. Their knowledge was so precise that they could often sail to a tiny, uninhabited island that was only a few miles wide. The margin for error was almost non-existent. The voyages themselves were also a testament to human resilience. The canoes, or vose, were not just vessels, they were floating villages. They carried not only a crew, but also plants, animals, and the seeds of a new home. On a long voyage, life on board was a microcosm of their society. Every person had a role, from bailing out water to tending to the food and water stores. The diet was often monotonous: preserved root vegetables, dried fish, but it was supplemented by fishing and careful rationing. The greatest enemy was not a sudden storm, but the slow, insidious drain of resources and morale. The lack of fresh water was a constant threat, and every drop was carefully monitored. As the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, the subtle psychological toll of being on the open ocean would begin to mount. The world was just water and sky, an endless expanse of blue. It was in these moments that the navigator's knowledge was most tested. They had to maintain not only their own faith, but the faith of the entire crew. They had to know with absolute certainty that land was just over the horizon, even if every sense told them otherwise. The question then was not just how they found their way, but how they maintained the unshakable belief in their own system, even when it seemed to have no visible signs of success. How did they hold on to hope when the sky remained dark for days on end and the open ocean seemed to swallow them whole? The final, and perhaps most difficult, aspect of the Polynesian voyages was not the sailing, but the arrival. After weeks or months on the open ocean, the first sight of land was not a moment of pure relief, but of profound tension. The navigator had to be certain they had arrived at the correct destination. Their entire reputation, and the survival of the crew, depended on their final confident identification of the landmass. This final stage of the journey was a culmination of all the knowledge they had accumulated, a final test of their skill and patience. The signs of land began to appear. Long before the land itself was visible, the water would change, a subtle shift in color from the deep indigo of the open ocean to a lighter, more vibrant blue. The air would grow more humid and carry the distinct smell of damp earth, decaying leaves, and fresh water. This was the scent of life, a fragrance carried on the wind from hundreds of miles away. Certain birds, like the Iwa and the Manu'oku white tern, would become more numerous. The navigators knew that these birds had a maximum range from land, and their constant presence was a sure sign that the destination was close. As they drew closer, they would begin to see floating debris: a coconut husk, a piece of wood, a stray branch. These were not random objects, but clues. A skilled navigator could tell, based on the type of debris, what kind of island lay ahead. The presence of fresh water, even a small amount, could be detected by the way it changed the color of the water or the type of seaweed that grew in a particular area. The navigators were master detectives, piecing together a mental map from 1,000 tiny clues. Once the land was finally sighted, the work was not over. The navigator's job was to identify the specific island. They did this by recognizing the unique shape of the island's mountain peaks, the specific way the waves broke on its reefs, and the pattern of its lagoons. They had a mental catalog of these visual landmarks, a library of geological and coastal features committed to memory. They were, in effect, seeing the island in their mind's eye long before it appeared on the horizon. This ability to mentally project a known image onto an unknown horizon was the final, and most crucial, step in their navigation. The arrival was not a single event, but a careful, methodical approach. The navigator would guide the canoe through the treacherous coral reefs, reading the subtle changes in the water's color that signaled a safe passage. The final few miles were often the most dangerous, and a single mistake could result in the destruction of the canoe and the loss of everything. The navigator's profound understanding of the ocean's currents and their intimate knowledge of the reef systems were the only things that stood between success and failure. The voyages of the Polynesians were more than just a series of successful explorations. They were a testament to a different kind of knowledge, one that was not reliant on technology or written records. It was a knowledge based on a profound connection to the natural world, a system of observation and intuition that has largely been lost in our modern technology-driven world. The Polynesians were able to map a third of the Earth's surface by a system we would consider boring and mundane, by watching the way the clouds moved, by listening to the rhythm of the waves, and by trusting their bodies to feel the subtle pulses of the ocean. Their story is a quiet challenge to our own assumptions about what constitutes knowledge and what it takes to explore the unknown. It reminds us that sometimes the most powerful tools are not the ones we build, but the ones we already possess: our senses, our memory, and our capacity for patience and observation. Their success was a quiet, unheralded revolution in human history, one that proved that with a deep enough understanding of the world around us, there are no limits to where we can go. The legacy of their incredible journey is not just a few scattered islands in the vast Pacific, but a living example of how human resilience and a quiet, profound wisdom can overcome even the most daunting of obstacles. Imagine waking up in a city where the sound of running water is a constant, gentle hum. It's in the fountains that line the streets, the public baths where you might go to socialize, and the latrines where you begin your day. This was the reality of daily life for a resident of ancient Rome, a life made possible by a vast, complex, and largely unseen network of engineering marvels, the aqueducts. While we often picture the grand towering arches that still stand today, these structures made up only a small fraction of the entire system. The true genius of the Roman aqueduct was its quiet, subterranean nature, a hidden river that flowed beneath the city, shaping every aspect of life from hygiene to social hierarchy. Before the aqueducts, life in Rome was much like any other ancient city. People relied on local wells, springs, and rainwater collected from their rooftops. This restricted Rome's growth and made sanitation a constant struggle. The Tiber River, while a source of water, was also a receptacle for waste. The city's reliance on these localized, often contaminated sources was a major barrier to its expansion. And public health. This all changed with the construction of the Aqua Appia, the first Roman aqueduct, built in 312 BCE, at just over 16 kilometers long. It was a modest beginning, but it marked a profound shift in the relationship between the city and its environment. The design of the aqueducts was deceptively simple. They relied entirely on gravity. Roman engineers, using basic surveying tools like the chorobates, a kind of water-level table, meticulously planned a continuous, slight downward gradient from a distant source, a mountain spring, or a clean river all the way to the city. The incline had to be just right. Too steep, and the water would flow too quickly, eroding the channels. Too shallow, and it would stagnate. The success of an aqueduct depended on this minute and precise calculation. Much of this immense network was invisible. The water channels, or spikas, were primarily underground tunnels. This served a dual purpose. It protected the water from evaporation and from enemies who might try to sabotage the city's water supply. The tunnels were carved through rock and lined with a waterproof cement made from volcanic ash known as pozzolana. The tunnels followed the contours of the land, snaking through hills and mountains, a silent river in the darkness. Only when the terrain made a subterranean channel impossible, such as when crossing a valley or a gorge, would they. Romans built the iconic arches we know today. These were not just for aesthetic appeal. They were a pragmatic solution to a topographical problem, a series of precisely engineered bridges that maintained the required slope. The most famous of these, like the Pont du Gard in modern-day France, were not just feats of engineering, but also a public statement of Roman power and a symbol of civilization that the flow of water was constant and abundant. At its peak, Rome's 11 aqueducts brought in an estimated 1 million cubic meters of water per day, a supply per capita that was not matched in many European cities until the modern era. This water didn't just go to public fountains. It fed the great public baths, a central part of Roman social life, and supplied water to private homes of the wealthy and public latrines. The water itself was a reflection of the city's hierarchy. The public fountains, known as Nasoni, provided free, clean drinking water to all citizens, a fundamental right that set Rome apart from its contemporaries. The public baths, like the baths of Caracalla, were supplied with a constant flow of hot and cold water, offering a place for all citizens to relax and socialize. The wealthiest citizens, however, paid a fee to have water piped directly to their homes. This system of distribution was managed by a team of officials and slaves with a clear priority. Public use came first, followed by public baths, and finally private users. It was a subtle yet powerful statement about the value of shared resources, but the abundance of water created its own set of challenges. The channels needed constant cleaning and repair, and the system was vulnerable to both natural wear and human interference. The vast network, while a symbol of Roman might, also required a tireless, unceasing effort to maintain. What happened when this intricate, almost perfect system faced the inevitable decay of time and the challenges of a sprawling, changing empire? The management of Rome's water was a quiet and constant battle against entropy. While the grand aqueducts are a testament to Roman engineering genius, their continued function depended on the meticulous, often mundane work of thousands of people. The system was managed by a public official known as the Curator Aquarum, a position of immense responsibility first held by the esteemed statesman Marcus Agrippa. His job was not just to oversee new construction, but to ensure the daily maintenance of the entire network. The aqueducts, for all their strength, were susceptible to a number of problems. The most common was the buildup of calcium carbonate, or limescale, from the hard water of the springs. This residue would gradually narrow the channels, reducing water flow. To combat this, teams of specialized workers, often slaves or freedmen, had to regularly enter the spikas to chip away the buildup. This was a dark, dangerous, and claustrophobic job, done in the complete absence of light, with only the echoes of their own tools for company. The channels were also prone to leaks, and entire sections had to be carefully drained and repaired. The fact that many of these tunnels are still structurally sound today is a testament to the quality of their original construction and the constant, tireless effort of these maintenance crews. Beyond the physical challenges, there was the problem of illegal tapping. The abundant water supply was a valuable resource, and unauthorized citizens would sometimes try to drill into the main pipes to get a free supply. These illegal connections, or punctures, were a constant nuisance and a drain on the system. The Curator Aquarum and his staff had to conduct regular inspections to find and seal these illicit pipes, ensuring that the water was distributed according to the law, and the public's needs were met first. The aqueduct system also had to deal with the inevitable challenges of nature. Floods could damage the arches and channels, and droughts could reduce the flow from the distant springs. To address this, the Romans built reservoirs and settling basins at various points along the aqueducts. These basins, known as piscinae, limaria, were large, multi-chambered tanks where the water could slow down, allowing sediment and debris to settle before the water continued its journey. This not only helped to clean the water, but also provided a buffer against fluctuations in the water supply. The most famous of these, the Castellum Aquae, was a huge reservoir at the end of the aqueduct, where the water was distributed to the city's various pipes. The very existence of the aqueducts reshaped the social fabric of Rome. The availability of clean, abundant water allowed for the construction of the famous public baths, which were more than just places to get clean. They were social centers, places for business meetings, relaxation, and exercise. For many Romans, particularly those who lived in crowded tenements without private plumbing, the baths were an essential part of daily life. The aqueducts, therefore, were not just a utilitarian tool. They were a foundation for a public culture that valued communal space and hygiene. The immense scale of the aqueduct system also created a new kind of urban landscape. The constant flow of water meant that Rome was a city of fountains. They were everywhere, providing not just drinking water, but also a sense of beauty and abundance. The water ran through public latrines, which were often grand, columned structures, where people could sit and talk while doing their business. The aqueducts transformed a once unhygienic city into a place where the flow of clean water was a given, an invisible force that powered the daily lives of hundreds of thousands of people. But the sheer size and complexity of this system raised an important question about its sustainability. Was such a grand and expensive project an act of genius or an act of hubris? The maintenance and defense of the aqueducts were a constant drain on the empire's resources, and their very existence made the city utterly dependent on them. What would happen if this quiet, hidden flow were ever to be stopped, either by an enemy, a natural disaster, or the simple decay of an empire? The decline of the Roman Empire was a slow, agonizing process, and the fate of its great aqueduct system mirrored this descent. The quiet hum of running water that defined Roman life eventually faded to a trickle, and then to silence. The reasons for this decline were complex, a mix of political instability, economic collapse, and a series of barbarian invasions that targeted the very lifelines of the city. One of the most immediate and impactful threats to the aqueducts came from invading armies. Unlike a city wall or a fortress, an aqueduct was a long exposed target. An enemy army, like the Goths led by King Vitiges in 537 CE, could easily cut off Rome's water supply by destroying a key section of the aqueduct arches. This was a form of siege warfare that didn't require storming the city walls. It simply required choking off the city's lifeblood. The Romans, increasingly unable to muster the resources and manpower for constant repairs, found themselves vulnerable. The silence that followed the destruction of the aqueducts was not just the absence of a sound. It was the end of a way of life, but the most significant factor in the aqueduct's demise was not a sudden act of war, but the slow, corrosive effect of economic decay. The maintenance of the vast network was an incredibly expensive undertaking, requiring not just skilled engineers, but a large, well-organized labor force. As the empire's economy contracted and tax revenues dwindled, the public funds necessary for repairs and upkeep became scarce. The curator Aquarum and his teams found it increasingly difficult to find the resources to clear blockages, repair leaks, and rebuild sections of the channels. The once clear water from the mountains became a murky mess, its flow a fraction of what it once was. The collapse of the central authority meant that the intricate system of laws and regulations that governed water distribution also fell apart. The private connections that had once been carefully monitored and taxed became rampant. Wealthy individuals hoarded what little water was left, leaving the public fountains dry. The communal spirit that the aqueducts had once fostered vanished, replaced by a desperate, every man for himself scramble for a basic necessity. The great public baths, once bustling centers of social life, became crumbling ruins. Their intricate hypocaust heating systems and vast pools stood empty, a ghost of a more civilized time. The legacy of the Roman aqueduct is a powerful one, not just for its engineering genius, but for what it teaches us about the fragility of civilization. The Romans understood that a city is more than just a collection of buildings. It is a complex, interconnected system. They invested in the boring, mundane details, in the plumbing and the sanitation, and in doing so, they created a society of unprecedented health, wealth, and culture. They proved that true power doesn't lie in grand monuments alone, but in the unseen infrastructure that supports daily life. The collapse of the aqueducts forced the residents of Rome to return to a pre-aqueduct way of life, relying on the Tiber River and local wells, a move that contributed to the spread of disease and a dramatic decline in public health. It was not until the late Middle Ages and the Renaissance that European cities began to rebuild a reliable water supply, often using the very principles pioneered by the Romans. The lessons of the aqueduct are therefore not just about the past, but about the future. They remind us that the invisible systems that support our modern lives, our power grids, our water supplies, our communication networks, are not just conveniences. They are the bedrock of our society. We often take them for granted, just as the Romans likely did, until they are gone. The quiet ruins of the Roman aqueducts stand as a silent monument to the enduring truth that the boring, unseen details of civilization are often the most important. The world of a medieval monastery was a place of quiet, methodical routine, and at its heart was the scriptorium, the room where books were made. To a modern observer, the life of a scribe would seem incredibly boring, a monotonous cycle of silence, cold, and meticulous repetitive work. But within the walls of this room, history was being copied, knowledge was being preserved, and the very foundation of Western thought was being painstakingly laid, one letter at a time. The life of a scribe was not one of adventure or drama, but of quiet, unceasing labor. A shadow existence lived in the service of a higher purpose. The day for a scribe began before dawn. The first task was not writing, but prayer. The monastic day was structured around a series of prayer services or canonical hours, and the scribe, like all monks, would participate in these before heading to the scriptorium. The work itself was often done in near total silence, a practice designed to foster concentration and spiritual reflection. The only sounds would be the scratching of a quill on parchment, the rustle of a page, and the soft shuffle of feet. Scribes worked from dawn until dusk, their day dictated by the position of the sun. There was no artificial light, as candles were a fire hazard and far too expensive to be used for something as mundane as writing. The tools of the trade were simple, yet specialized. The most important was the quill, usually made from a goose feather. The scribe would have to constantly sharpen the tip with a small knife or penknife to maintain a fine point. The ink was a viscous liquid, often made from gallnuts mixed with iron sulfate, which produced a deep, permanent black. The most crucial and expensive material was the parchment, made from the scraped, stretched, and dried skins of animals, usually sheep or calves. Creating a single book, especially a large one like a Bible, could require the skins of dozens or even hundreds of animals. The cost of the materials alone made books incredibly valuable, a fact that imbued the scribes. Work with an even greater sense of responsibility that the actual process of writing was an act of profound concentration. The scribe would sit hunched over a sloped desk, copying a text from an exemplar or original manuscript. The work was not just about transcribing words. It was about replicating the layout, the punctuation, and even the stylistic quirks of them. Original. The scribe had to be a master of the alphabet, but also a skilled artist. Many manuscripts included illuminations, intricate and colorful illustrations that decorated the pages. This work was often done by a different, highly skilled monk known as an illuminator. The scribe's job was to leave space for these designs, and to mark the beginning of a new chapter or section with a large, decorative initial capital. The boredom of the work was a constant companion. A scribe would spend hours, days, and even years copying a single text. It was a monotonous cycle of dipping the quill in ink, forming each letter with precise strokes, and carefully turning the pages. This repetitive labor, however, was not seen as a curse. For many monks, it was a form of spiritual discipline, an act of penance and devotion. The physical act of writing became a kind of prayer, a silent meditation on the words they were preserving. Despite this focus on spiritual purpose, the life of a scribe was not without its mundane realities and challenges. The cold of the stone, building in winter, the cramps in their hands, the eye strain from working in poor light, these were all part of the daily grind. Mistakes were a constant threat. A single miscopied word could change the meaning of a text, and a major error could require an entire page to be scraped clean and rewritten. It was a world where perfection was the goal, and the margin for error was almost non-existent. What happened then when a scribe, living this quiet and meticulous life, made a mistake? What were the quiet, unspoken dangers that lurked in the shadows of the scriptorium? The quiet world of the scriptorium was not immune to the small dramas of human error. A mistake for a scribe was not just a simple oversight. It was a potential crisis. The precious parchment, the hours of labor, and the spiritual significance of the text were all at risk. When a scribe made an error, the first response was to correct it in a way that was both discreet and efficient. The most common method was to scrape away the faulty letters with a sharp knife. This required a delicate touch. Too much pressure could tear a hole in the parchment, rendering the entire page unusable. The scraped surface was then polished with a smooth stone, or a burnisher, to prepare it for the new ink. This was a tedious and time-consuming process, and it was a constant reminder of the scribe's fallibility. Beyond simple scraping, scribes developed a system of abbreviations and corrections to save time and parchment. They would write marginal notes, add extra words above the line, or use a small symbol to indicate a missing word or phrase. These seemingly minor details are, in fact, incredibly valuable to modern historians, providing a glimpse into the minds of the scribes and the challenges they faced. A misspelled word in a 14th century text might not be an error at all, but a reflection of a different dialect or a common slip of the pen. The mistakes themselves tell a story that the challenges went beyond human error. The physical environment of the scriptorium was often harsh. The ink, made from iron gall, was acidic and could eat away at the parchment over time. The cold in the winter months could cause a scribe's hands to cramp, leading to mistakes. The boredom of the work was a real psychological challenge. Scribes would often leave notes to themselves or to future readers in the margins of their manuscripts, known as marginalia. These notes could be a complaint about the cold, a prayer for an end to their work, or even a short, humorous drawing. These small, personal touches are a window into the inner lives of these anonymous workers. One famous note from a tired scribe reads, "Oh my hand." Another, "Thank God, it is finished. Give me a drink, master." The silent work of the scribe was also a slow process of change. As they copied texts, they would often introduce subtle variations. A word might be slightly misspelled, a sentence rephrased for clarity, or an extra detail might be added based on the scribe's own knowledge. Over many generations of copying, these small changes could accumulate, resulting in different versions of the same text. The history of a single manuscript can be traced through the hands of the different scribes who worked on it, each one leaving their own quiet mark. This process was not seen as a form of corruption, but as a living, organic tradition. The role of the scribe was a lonely one, often spent in isolation, but it was a crucial part of the monastery's mission. Their work was not just about making books. It was about preserving the very memory of a civilization. They copied not only religious texts but also works of history, philosophy, and science from ancient Greece and Rome. They were the silent guardians of knowledge, the quiet librarians of a world that had largely forgotten how to read and write. But what happened to this meticulous, time-consuming work as the world outside the monastery walls began to change? What was the fate of the scribe when a new technology emerged that could replicate a book in a fraction of the time and at a fraction of the cost? The slow, patient work of the medieval scribe was brought to a quiet and ultimately decisive end by one of the most significant technological innovations in human history, the printing press. The moment Johannes Gutenberg perfected his movable type printing press in the mid-15th century, the role of the scribe began its long, gradual decline into obsolescence. The transition was not instantaneous. For decades, manuscripts continued to be produced alongside printed books, but the writing was on the wall, or more accurately on the printed page. The impact of the printing press was not just on the scribe's profession. It was a revolution in the very nature of knowledge itself. A single scribe, working tirelessly for a year, might produce one or two large books. The printing press could produce hundreds of copies of the same book in the same amount of time. The cost of a book plummeted, making knowledge accessible to a wider audience than ever before. This led to a massive increase in literacy rates and a demand for books on a wide range of subjects, from religious texts to scientific treatises to novels. The silent, secluded world of the scriptorium, where knowledge was a rare and precious commodity, was replaced by a noisy, bustling world of printing houses and book fairs, where ideas could be disseminated at an unprecedented speed. For the scribes themselves, this change was the end of a long and honorable tradition. Their quiet, disciplined labor, once seen as a spiritual act and a crucial service to God and humanity, was no longer necessary. Many scribes had to find new roles within the monastery, often as librarians or teachers, while others left the monastic life altogether. The meticulous artistry of the scribe's hand was replaced by the uniformity of the machine. The beautiful, unique imperfections of a handwritten manuscript, the slight tremor of a weary hand, the unique flourish of a capital letter were gone, replaced by the perfect, mechanical repetition of movable type. The legacy of the scribe, however, is not a story of defeat but of profound historical significance. By their quiet, anonymous work, they preserved the accumulated knowledge of antiquity and the Middle Ages. Without their tireless copying, the works of figures like Aristotle, Plato, and countless early Christian thinkers would have been lost to history. They were the bridge between the ancient world and the Renaissance, the humble workers who kept the flame of learning alive during a period of immense social and political upheaval. The very texts that inspired the great thinkers of the Renaissance were the ones that had been painstakingly copied and preserved in the cold, silent rooms of 1,000 scriptoria. The story of the scribe's decline is a powerful reflection on the relationship between humanity and technology. The printing press was not an evil machine that destroyed a beautiful tradition. It was a tool that democratized knowledge and unleashed a wave of intellectual and social change. The scribe's work was a quiet, almost invisible part of history, but its impact was colossal. It reminds us that progress is not always about grand battles or sweeping political movements. It is often about the quiet, monotonous work of ordinary people and the slow, inevitable march of technological change. The scribe's shadow, though no longer visible in our world, still rests on every book we read, a testament to the power of a single written word. The Silk Road is a name that conjures up images of exotic caravans, bustling markets, and grand journeys across vast deserts. It's a name that speaks of high adventure and even higher stakes. But for the vast majority of people who lived and worked along its routes, the Silk Road was not a grand adventure. It was a matter of quiet, repetitive labor. For a weaver in a small village in Persia or Central Asia, the Silk Road was not a road at all, but a constant, subtle presence that shaped every aspect of their lives. It was in the dust that settled on their looms, in the threads they worked with, and in the distant sound of camel bells. The life of a weaver was one of immense skill and profound patience, a daily grind of crafting a product that would travel thousands of miles to adorn the palaces of distant emperors. The day for a weaver began before sunrise. The sound of the loom, a rhythmic thumping and clacking, was the soundtrack of their lives. The work was physically demanding and often done in cramped, poorly lit spaces. The tools of the trade were simple, yet ancient. A wooden loom, a series of shuttles and bobbins, and a comb-like tool to pack the threads tightly. The weavers sat on the ground, their body becoming one with the loom, their hands moving with a practiced, almost subconscious rhythm. The work was a slow, meditative dance of passing the shuttle back and forth. 1,000 times an hour, 1,000,000 times a year. The raw materials themselves were a testament to the Silk Road's influence. While many weavers worked with more common materials like wool and cotton, the most coveted material was, of course, silk. The secret of silk production, or sericulture, was guarded by the Chinese for centuries. But eventually, the knowledge, and with it the silkworms and mulberry trees, made its way westward. A weaver in Samarkand might work with silk from China, wool from the steppes, and cotton from India. The colors came from an equally diverse range of sources: deep reds from crushed insects, vibrant blues from indigo plants, and brilliant yellows from saffron or turmeric. The weaver was not just a craftsman. They were a chemist and an artist, mixing dyes to achieve the perfect shade, a skill passed down through generations. The patterns they wove told stories. A carpet from Persia might feature intricate geometric designs. A Chinese silk tapestry might depict a scene from a folk tale, and a Central Asian textile might be covered in symbols of good fortune. These patterns were not random. They were a complex language, a visual representation of a culture's beliefs, history, and aesthetics. The weaver, through their hands, was translating an entire worldview into a tangible, beautiful object. They were preserving history in every thread. They laid. The weaver's connection to the Silk Road was often an indirect one. They might never see a camel caravan or meet a foreign merchant. Their work was mediated by a series of intermediaries: the silk trader who brought the raw materials, the local merchant who purchased the finished goods, and the caravaneer who carried them to the next major trading hub. Yet, the demands of this vast, interconnected network were felt in their daily lives. The quality of their work had to be impeccable, and the patterns had to be precise, as their product would be judged by a merchant thousands of miles away. It was a pressure that was always there, a quiet, unspoken expectation that their work would be worthy of a journey that spanned continents. But what happened when the threads of this intricate network frayed? When a weaver's creation, the product of countless hours of labor, failed to meet the demands of this unforgiving system. The unforgiving nature of the Silk Road meant that a weaver's craftsmanship was under constant, silent scrutiny. A single flaw in a textile, a misstep in a dye lot, could mean the difference between a life of modest comfort and one of grinding poverty. The merchants who traversed the road were not artisans themselves. They were businessmen. They judged a product not on the hours of labor or the beauty of the design, but on its marketability in a distant city. A carpet that was too coarse, a silk that was not the right shade of blue, could be rejected outright, leaving the weaver with nothing but the product of months of work. This pressure was compounded by the subtle but constant influence of global trends. A weaver in a small Persian village might not know what was fashionable in Constantinople, but the merchant who bought their goods did. The demand for a certain type of pattern or color could shift with the whims of an emperor or the changing tastes of a wealthy elite. A weaver who had spent their life mastering a certain style might suddenly find that their skill was no longer in demand. To survive, they had to be adaptable, constantly learning new techniques and adopting new designs, often based on vague and second-hand information passed down by a traveling merchant. The threads themselves held their own dangers. Weavers were constantly exposed to the dust and fibers of the materials they worked with. The dyes, made from natural sources but often mixed with harsh chemicals, could be toxic. The repetitive motions of weaving led to a host of physical ailments: carpal tunnel syndrome, back pain, and eye strain. The life of a weaver was not a romantic one. It was a life of physical hardship and constant exposure to the dangers of their craft. The Silk Road was also a network of ideas, and this had a profound effect on the weaver's craft. As goods moved eastward and westward, so too did techniques and patterns. The intricate geometric designs of Islamic art, for example, found their way into Chinese textiles, and the vibrant, floral patterns of Indian cloth influenced weavers in the Mediterranean. A weaver in Central Asia might have learned a new knotting technique from a traveler passing through, or adopted a new color from a pigment that had never been seen in their region before. This exchange was a slow, organic process, but it meant that the weaver's craft was in a state of constant evolution. But this exchange also created a quiet tension. The traditions of a community, the patterns that had been passed down from mother to daughter for generations, were now in competition with new ideas. A weaver had to find a balance between honoring their heritage and adapting to the demands of a global marketplace. What happened when this delicate balance was broken? What was the fate of a weaver whose work, though technically perfect, was deemed to be out of fashion in a distant land? The fate of a weaver on the Silk Road was often decided not by their skill, but by the unpredictable forces of a global market far beyond their control. A change in fashion in a distant court, the collapse of a dynasty, or a new trade route could render an entire village's specialty obsolete. The weavers who had perfected their craft over generations were often left with a product that, while beautiful and technically flawless, was worthless in the eyes of the merchants. This quiet economic reality was the constant backdrop to their lives. The slow death of a traditional weaving style was not a dramatic event. It was a slow, agonizing process. The demand for a certain type of carpet might gradually dwindle. The prices offered for a specific kind of silk might fall to a point where it was no longer profitable to produce. Young apprentices, seeing the diminishing returns, would turn to other professions. The ancient knowledge, passed down with such care, would begin to fade. The sound of the looms in a village that had once been known for its textiles would grow quieter, and eventually the rhythm of the loom would fall silent altogether. But the story of the weaver on the Silk Road is not just one of decline, it is also one of immense resilience. The weavers, like the artisans and merchants they served, were survivors. When a style fell out of favor, they adapted. They learned new techniques, adopted new patterns, and found new markets. They were a crucial part of the Silk Road's living, breathing ecosystem, a testament to the quiet, everyday human ingenuity that made the grand narratives of trade and exploration possible. They were the ones who translated abstract ideas of beauty and wealth into tangible objects, and in doing so, they left an indelible mark on the art and culture of the world. Today, the legacy of the Silk Road weavers can be seen in the vibrant textiles and carpets that are still produced in the regions that were once at the heart of the trade route. The patterns, colors, and techniques are a living history, a testament to the countless hours of quiet, patient labor that went into their creation. The Ao, or navigator, was not a grand explorer, but a quiet scientist of the sea. The Romang Aqueduct was not a dramatic monument, but a mundane feat of plumbing. And the Silk Road was not just a caravan route. It was a network of 1,000 quiet villages where ordinary people, like the weavers, spent their lives creating the objects that made the trade possible. The story of the Silk Road, then, is not the story of kings and emperors, but of the dust and threads that they left behind. That we tend to think of history's great moments as being defined by grand narratives: the building of an empire, the fall of a city, the invention of a new weapon. But often, the most significant changes are born from the most mundane and boring details of daily life. The invention of the abacus, a seemingly simple tool for counting, is one such story. We don't know who invented it or where exactly, but its origins are often traced to ancient Mesopotamia, where it emerged from the need to manage the incredibly complex bureaucratic and economic systems of the world's first cities. The abacus was not a flashy invention, but a quiet, almost invisible tool that transformed the way humans thought about numbers, and, in doing so, laid the groundwork for everything from commerce to mathematics. Before the abacus, people used a variety of simple methods for counting. They used their fingers, tally sticks, or arranged stones or beads in patterns on the ground. These methods were effective for simple arithmetic, but became cumbersome for large numbers and complex calculations. The rise of large-scale agriculture, the collection of taxes, and the management of trade routes required a system that could handle more than just a handful of figures. It was this need for a more efficient way to count and calculate that led to the development of the abacus. The earliest forms of the abacus were not the bead and wire frames we are familiar with today. They were likely a counting board or a flat slab of stone or wood with grooves or lines drawn in the sand. Pebbles or stones would be placed in these grooves, with each groove representing a different decimal place: units, tens, hundreds, and so on. The pebbles were markers, a physical representation of abstract numbers. A single pebble in the tens groove represented 10 units. A pebble in the hundreds groove represented 100. This system, which we now call a place value system, was a profound leap forward in human thought. It freed people from having to count every single object and allowed them to represent large numbers with a small number of physical objects. The genius of this early abacus was its simplicity. It was a purely mechanical tool, and its use did not require a deep understanding of mathematical theory. A merchant could use it to add up the cost of a transaction. A tax collector could use it to tally grain, and an administrator could use it to keep track of a city's population. It was a tool for the masses, a silent partner in the daily business of civilization. Its use spread from Mesopotamia to ancient Greece, Rome, and eventually to China and other parts of Asia. The design evolved over time, from a board with pebbles to a frame with beads, but the fundamental principle remained the same. The abacus was a revolution not because it was complex, but because it was so profoundly simple. It was a tool that allowed people to perform calculations without having to rely on their memory, a common problem in an age before widespread literacy. It was a way of externalizing thought, of moving abstract numbers from the mind into the physical world. It allowed for a level of accuracy and speed that was simply not possible with earlier counting methods. But the abacus, for all its power, was a tool that required an immense amount of trust. How could one be sure that the numbers represented by the beads were correct? And what happened when a calculation, no matter how precise, revealed a truth that a king or an emperor did not want to hear? The silent power of the abacus was its capacity for objective truth. Unlike the human memory, which is fallible and susceptible to bias, The beads of the abacus represented a cold, hard, and undeniable reality. A merchant could not argue with the result of a calculation. A tax collector could not inflate a number to line their own pockets without leaving a clear physical trail. This objectivity made the abacus an invaluable tool for ensuring a degree of accountability in the world's first complex economic systems. But it also created a new kind of social tension. For the first time, people had a tool that could reveal a truth that was contrary to their own interests. A tax collector who used the abacus to show a lower revenue than expected might face the wrath of a king. A merchant who used it to demonstrate a loss on a transaction might be accused of incompetence. The abacus was not just a tool for counting. It was a tool for revealing truth. And in a world where truth was often inconvenient, this made it a silent but dangerous companion. The use of the abacus also led to the rise of a new class of people, the calculators or accountants. These were individuals who were not just literate, but also highly skilled in the use of the counting board. They were the keepers of the numbers, the ones who could make sense of the vast and complex ledgers of a city's economy. Their skill was not in the physical act of moving beads, but in their ability to translate the abstract world of finance into the tangible world of the abacus. They were the human bridge between the numbers and the people who needed to understand them. Their quiet work in the back rooms of temples and palaces was what made the grand projects of the ancient world, the construction of pyramids, the organization of armies, the management of a trade empire possible. The abacus was so important that it was not just a tool for a profession, but an element of daily life. It was a common sight in the market, in the tax collector's office, and in the temples, where priests managed vast amounts of wealth. Its simplicity and effectiveness made it a tool for everyone, from the lowest trader to the most powerful administrator. It was a universal language of numbers that transcended spoken language and cultural barriers. A merchant from Babylon could use the abacus to transact business with a merchant from Egypt, even if they could not speak the same language. It was a silent, universal translator, but the abacus, for all its revolutionary power, was a tool of a specific kind of knowledge. It was excellent for addition, subtraction, multiplication, and even division. But it was not a tool for abstract mathematics. It could tell you the result of a calculation, but it could not explain the underlying principles. It was a tool of applied math, not of theoretical math. And as the world's thinkers began to move from the practical concerns of daily life to the more abstract questions of the universe, a new kind of thinking was needed. What would replace the abacus as the primary tool of human calculation? And how would this new way of thinking about numbers change the very course of history? The abacus, for all its revolutionary impact, was ultimately a tool of a limited scope. It was a tool of a kind of mathematics that was mechanical and applied, but not abstract or theoretical. It was a tool for finding an answer, not for understanding the principles behind that answer. As the world moved from simple trade and administration to complex scientific inquiry, a new way of thinking about numbers was needed. This transition, which began in the Islamic Golden Age and continued in the European Renaissance, was the silent, long goodbye to the abacus as the primary tool of human calculation. The key to this revolution was not a new tool, but a new concept. The Hindu-Arabic numeral system, which included the revolutionary idea of a zero. While the abacus had a kind of zero, an empty space on the counting board, it was not a number in itself. The new system, which used symbols to represent every number from 0 to 9, allowed for complex calculations to be done on paper without the need for a physical counting device. It was a system that was more portable, more flexible, and more conducive to abstract thought. A mathematician could now work out a complex equation on a piece of paper and then carry that paper with them, a freedom that was simply not possible with a large, physical counting board. This transition was not easy. The abacisists, those who championed the use of the abacus, fought a long and bitter war of ideas with the Algorists, those who advocated for the new Hindu-Arabic system. The Abbasists argued that their system was more reliable, less prone to human error, and more intuitive. The Algorists argued that their system was more efficient, more flexible, and more powerful. In the end, the Algorists won, not through a single decisive victory, but through a slow, quiet process of adoption. The new system was simply more powerful, and its advantages eventually outweighed the inertia of tradition. The decline of the abacus was a perfect example of a technological shift that, while seemingly boring and technical, had a profound impact on human history. The ability to do complex calculations on paper made possible the great intellectual achievements of the Renaissance and the scientific revolution. It allowed for the development of everything from calculus to modern physics. It was the foundation of the very idea of a spreadsheet, a concept that now underpins the global economy. The abacus, once the silent partner in every major human transaction, was relegated to the status of a niche tool, a historical artifact. The legacy of the abacus is a quiet one, but it is deeply embedded in our modern world. It taught us the power of a place value system, a concept that is now so ingrained in our minds that we can't imagine a world without it. It was the first tool that allowed us to externalize our thoughts, to move our calculations from our minds to a physical object. It was a humble, unheralded invention that in its silent way paved the way for the digital age. The abacus may be gone, but its spirit lives on in every calculator, every computer, and every spreadsheet we use today, a testament to the power of the most mundane and boring inventions. The potato is perhaps the most boring of all vegetables. It is bland, starchy, and grows in the dirt. But this humble tuber, a native of the high Andes Mountains of South America, is arguably one of the most important foods in human history. Its journey from a staple of a quiet, agricultural society to a world-altering crop is a story of quiet resilience, accidental discovery, and a series of seemingly mundane facts that would reshape empires and fuel a population boom. The potato was not a spice or a rare gem, but a simple, starchy food that would, in its own silent way, bring down kings and fuel revolutions. For thousands of years, the potato was cultivated by the indigenous peoples of the Andes, particularly the Inca. They had developed thousands of varieties, each adapted to a specific altitude, climate, and soil type. They understood the potato's unique qualities, its ability to grow in harsh, cold climates, its incredible caloric density, and its long shelf life. The potato was not just a food source for the Inca. It was a form of currency, a symbol of stability, and a central pillar of their civilization. They even developed a technique to freeze-dry potatoes, creating a lightweight and durable food source called chuno, which could be stored for years. This quiet agricultural innovation was the bedrock of their empire, allowing them to feed a vast population and a large army. When the Spanish conquistadors arrived in the 16th century, they were looking for gold, not for a starchy root. They saw the potato as a curiosity, a food for the locals, and largely ignored it. It was brought back to Europe not as a prized commodity, but as a botanical specimen for royal gardens. For decades, the potato was treated with suspicion. Europeans, unfamiliar with the tuber, feared it was poisonous. Some even believed it caused leprosy. It was a food for the poor, and even then, it was not widely adopted. It was a vegetable without a home, a wanderer that had traveled across an ocean only to be treated with suspicion. This initial resistance to the potato was rooted in a cultural bias. Europeans were used to grains like wheat and rye. The idea of eating a root that grew in the dirt was seen as a sign of poverty and desperation. But the potato had a quiet secret that would eventually win over the skeptics. Unlike grain, which required large, flat fields and a lot of labor to plant, harvest, and process, The potato could be grown in small plots, on hillsides, and in poor soil. It produced more calories per acre than any grain crop, and its nutritional value, especially with its vitamin C content, was far superior to the staple diets of most Europeans. The potato's great strength, however, was also its great weakness. It was a monoculture, a single crop that, when a blight or disease struck, could wipe out an entire season's harvest. It was a silent, ticking time bomb, a foundation of an empire that was built on a single vulnerable pillar. How would Europe, a continent on the brink of a population boom, handle this new, unpredictable food source? And what would happen when the quiet, reliable tuber failed? The quiet acceptance of the potato in Europe was a slow, uneven process. It was a food for the desperate and the poor, and it took a series of famines and wars to change perceptions. During the 30 Years' War, 1618 to 1648, armies marching across Europe would seize grain crops, but often left the potatoes in the ground as they were unfamiliar with the tuber and did not consider them worth the effort. This accidental oversight proved to be a lifeline for the peasants whose grain crops had been destroyed. They survived on the humble potato, and its reputation as a reliable and resilient food began to grow. The potato's greatest champion was the French pharmacist and agronomist Antoine-Augustin Parmentier. During the 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1763, he was captured by the Prussians and fed a diet of potatoes. He was impressed by the tuber's nutritional value and its ability to sustain a large population. When he returned to France, he became a tireless advocate for the potato. He hosted lavish dinner parties where every dish was made from potatoes, and even convinced King Louis XVI to wear a potato flower on his lapel. The king, in a brilliant act of psychological marketing, had a patch of potatoes planted and guarded by soldiers. This made the public believe the crop was incredibly valuable, and they would sneak into the field at night to steal the potatoes, which was exactly what Parmentier hoped for. The potato, once a food for the poor, became a symbol of a new, enlightened approach to agriculture. The quiet revolution of the potato was not just about food. It was about demographics. The potato's incredible caloric density meant that a family could produce enough food to survive on a much smaller plot of land than was required for grain. This led to a dramatic increase in the European population. The potato-fueled population boom was a major factor in the Industrial Revolution, as it created a large, cheap labor force that was needed to work in the new factories. The potato was, in a very real sense, the fuel that powered the engines of industrial change. It was a silent, unheralded force that reshaped the economic and social landscape of a continent. But this quiet success was also a prelude to a catastrophic failure. The reliance on a single crop, and often a single variety of that crop, created a dangerous monoculture. The humble potato, once a symbol of resilience, was now a ticking time bomb. Its very success made it vulnerable. What would happen when a blight, a fungus, or a disease finally caught up with this global wanderer? And what would the consequences be for the millions of people who had come to depend on it? The quiet, unheralded success of the potato in Europe set the stage for one of history's great famines, the Irish potato famine of the 1840s. The Irish, in particular, had become almost entirely dependent on the potato. It was a crop that thrived in the cool, damp climate of Ireland and could produce a massive yield from a small plot of land. It was a food that sustained a rapidly growing population, and by the 1840s, an estimated 1/3 of the population relied solely on the potato for sustenance. This was a precarious existence, a civilization built on a single, vulnerable pillar. The vulnerability of the potato was exposed by a microscopic fungus, Phytophthora infestans, or potato blight. The blight, which had likely originated in the Andes, made its way to Europe and arrived in Ireland in 1845. It spread with terrifying speed. turning a healthy field of potatoes into a rotting, unusable mess in a matter of days. The famine that followed was not a sudden, dramatic event. It was a slow, agonizing process of starvation, disease, and forced migration. For years, the blight returned, a constant, silent destroyer that devastated the country. The British government's response was slow and inadequate, and millions of Irish either died of starvation or emigrated. Many to the United States. The famine was a brutal lesson in the dangers of agricultural monoculture and the profound impact of a simple crop on the fate of an entire nation. The potato, once a quiet savior, became a symbol of a national tragedy. The famine was a major catalyst for Irish nationalism and the push for independence from Britain. It was a tragedy that was not caused by a single, dramatic event, but by a series of quiet, seemingly boring facts: the plant's incredible productivity, the country's over-reliance on a single crop, and the silent, invisible power of a fungal spore. The legacy of the potato is complex. On the one hand, it was a quiet, unheralded hero that fueled a global population boom and laid the groundwork for the Industrial Revolution. On the other, it was a food that exposed the fragility of a civilization and led to one of the greatest human tragedies of the 19th century. The potato's journey from the Andes to the world's dinner tables is a testament to the power of a simple food to change the course of history, not through a dramatic act of war or discovery, but through the quiet, unceasing work of a plant and the people who learned to depend on it. The story of the potato reminds us that the most significant events in history are often rooted in the most mundane and boring details of daily life. The ocean is a vast and unforgiving space. For millennia, sailors navigated by the sun and stars, using a system of quiet, intuitive knowledge. But as trade routes grew more complex and ships became larger, a new kind of navigational tool was needed. The answer was not a new kind of compass or sextant, but a simple stone tower with a light at the top. The lighthouse was not a dramatic invention, but a patient, silent watcher that stood on the world's most dangerous coastlines. A single flickering beacon that provided a sense of certainty in a world of profound uncertainty. The history of the lighthouse is a history of global trade, a quiet chronicle of a system that allowed merchants to travel safely and consistently, and in doing so, to build the foundations of our modern world. The earliest lighthouses were not the technologically advanced structures we know today. They were simple bonfires lit on a cliffside, a flame tended by a lone watchman to guide ships into a harbor. The most famous of these ancient beacons was the Lighthouse of Alexandria, a wonder of the ancient world that stood over 100 meters high. Its light was not from a fire, but from a system of mirrors that reflected sunlight during the day and a fire at night, a testament to the sophistication of ancient engineering. But for centuries after its construction, the art of lighthouse building was largely lost. The Dark Ages saw a decline in global trade, and with it, a decline in the need for complex navigational aids. The resurgence of the lighthouse began in the Middle Ages with the rise of Italian city-states and the expansion of maritime trade in the Mediterranean. These early lighthouses were often built by religious orders or guilds, a public service to protect the trade that fueled their economies. They were often simple stone towers with a brazier of wood or coal at the top. The work of the lighthouse keeper was a solitary one, a monotonous cycle of tending the fire, ensuring it never went out, and watching the sea. The job was one of profound responsibility. A single misstep could lead to a shipwreck and the loss of lives and fortunes. The light itself was not the only thing that a lighthouse provided. It was also a landmark. A ship's captain, knowing the location of a particular lighthouse, could confirm their position and adjust their course. The lighthouses were, in effect, a series of fixed points that helped to map the world's coastlines. They were the silent partners of the cartographers, the unmoving reference points that made accurate navigation possible. The simple act of a ship's captain seeing a light on the horizon was a profound moment, a feeling of relief and certainty after weeks at sea. It was a visual confirmation that their calculations were correct and that they were on the right course. But what happened when that quiet, flickering light was not where it was supposed to be? And what was the fate of a lighthouse keeper when their isolated existence was disrupted by a new kind of technology? The lighthouse keeper's life was one of profound isolation and quiet routine. They were the silent guardians of the coastline, and their world was a small stone tower, a flickering light, and the vast, unending expanse of the sea. The job was not just about lighting a fire. It was about managing a complex piece of machinery. By the 18th and 19th centuries, lighthouses had become technologically advanced structures, powered by everything from whale oil to paraffin lamps. The light itself was often magnified by a system of lenses and mirrors, a Fresnel lens being the most famous example. The lens, a French invention, could concentrate a small light source into a powerful, focused beam that could be seen for miles. The lighthouse keeper's job was to maintain this intricate machinery. They had to clean the lens, trim the wicks, and ensure the clockwork mechanism that made the light revolve was always working. They had to keep a logbook of every ship that passed, the weather conditions, and any other notable events. This was not a job for the faint of heart. The keeper's life was a constant battle against the elements, against the loneliness of their existence, and against the immense pressure of their responsibility. A single error could lead to a catastrophic shipwreck. The lighthouses themselves were not all the same. Each one had a unique light pattern, a signature that a ship's captain could use to identify their location. A lighthouse might flash a single beam every 5 seconds, or a series of 2 flashes followed by a pause. These seemingly mundane details were a kind of code, a silent language that allowed navigators to pinpoint their exact location on a map. This system of unique light signatures transformed the world of maritime navigation. It allowed for greater precision and made it possible to navigate even in a thick fog or a storm. But the lighthouse was not just a tool for navigation. It was also a symbol. For sailors who had been at sea for months, a lighthouse on the horizon was a sign of hope, a promise of land and safety. It was a beacon of civilization in a world of wild, untamed nature. It was a silent testament to the ingenuity and resilience of human beings, a reminder that even in the most remote and dangerous places, someone was watching, someone was tending the light. But what happened when this quiet, reliable system was challenged by the even more powerful forces of nature? What was the fate of a lighthouse when a storm of unprecedented power finally came to call? The quiet, unyielding presence of a lighthouse was a constant challenge to the raw, untamed power of the sea. Throughout history, these silent sentinels of the coast were battered by storms, pounded by waves, and subjected to the relentless forces of nature. The story of a lighthouse is often a testament to human resilience, a chronicle of a constant battle against the elements. The most famous of these stories is the construction of the Eddystone Lighthouse off the coast of Cornwall, England. The first 2 versions of the lighthouse were destroyed by storms, a testament to the immense power of the ocean. It was only with the 3rd version, designed by John Smeaton in the 18th century, that engineers finally found a way to build a structure that could withstand the sea. Smeaton's design, which mimicked the shape of a tree trunk, used interlocking stone blocks that were held together by dovetail joints, a technique that was both simple and brilliant. It was a boring, technical detail that made all the difference, a testament to the fact that the most significant human achievements are often built on a foundation of unglamorous, patient engineering. The development of the lighthouse also reflects the evolution of our relationship with technology. The light, once a simple fire, became a complex piece of machinery powered by clockwork and intricate lenses. The job of the lighthouse keeper, once a simple matter of tending a flame, became one of a highly skilled technician. But the quiet, unyielding march of technology eventually made the keeper obsolete. The invention of the automated lighthouse, powered by electricity and controlled remotely, meant that a human presence was no longer needed. The last manned lighthouse in the United States was automated in 1990, and the last in the United Kingdom in 1998. The solitary, romantic figure of the lighthouse keeper was gone, replaced by a silent, efficient machine. The legacy of the lighthouse is a quiet one. It is not in the great battles of history or the grand narratives of political change. It is in the countless ships that were guided safely to port, in the lives that were saved, and in the global trade routes that were made possible. The lighthouse was a quiet, unheralded part of the system that connected the world, a silent beacon that stood watch over a world of constant motion and change. It was a testament to the power of a single consistent idea, a flickering light in the darkness that gave us a sense of place and a sense of direction. The story of the lighthouse reminds us that the most significant impacts on our world often come from the most boring and mundane of things: a simple stone tower, a flickering light, and a dedicated person who is willing to watch the sea. Great scientific breakthroughs are often portrayed as moments of brilliant insight, a sudden flash of genius that changes the world forever. The story of penicillin is not one of these moments. It is instead a story of quiet observation, of a messy laboratory, and of a series of seemingly mundane and accidental events that would, in a very real and profound way, change the course of human history. The discovery of the world's first antibiotic was not a planned revolution. It was a quiet, almost embarrassing surprise that would go on to save hundreds of millions of lives. Our story begins in 1928, in the small, cluttered laboratory of Alexander Fleming at St. Mary's Hospital in London. Fleming was a bacteriologist, and his work was, by all accounts, meticulous but unglamorous. He was studying the Staphylococcus bacteria, a common cause of infection. His lab was a mess, often filled with unwashed Petri dishes that he would return to after a short vacation. This particular summer, he left a stack of these dishes on a workbench while he was away. A Petri dish is a small round glass plate used to culture bacteria. When he returned from his holiday in late August, he began the boring and tedious task of cleaning his lab. As he was sorting through the dirty dishes, he noticed something strange in one of them. On a plate that was swarming with Staphylococcus bacteria, there was a small patch of mold. This in itself was not unusual. Mold spores are everywhere, and they often contaminate Petri dishes. But what was unusual was the area around the mold. The bacteria that were growing so thickly on the rest of the dish had vanished. It was as if a silent, invisible hand had erased them from the plate. The mold had created a clear, bacteria-free zone around it, a stark and undeniable line in the sand dot to a less observant scientist. This would have been a nuisance, a contaminated dish to be discarded and forgotten. But Fleming was a keen observer of the mundane. He recognized that something important was happening. He isolated the mold and identified it as a species of penicillium. He named the substance it produced penicillin. The mold was quietly and effectively killing the bacteria. Fleming's initial discovery was a moment of profound curiosity, but not of world-changing application. He was a bacteriologist, not a chemist. He couldn't figure out how to isolate the active substance in a pure and stable form. The penicillin he created was an unstable juice that was difficult to work with. He found it was effective against a variety of bacteria, but it was too difficult to produce in large quantities. He wrote about his findings in a small scientific journal, and for a decade, the discovery sat there, a quiet, almost forgotten note in the annals of science. It was a brilliant observation, but it was a long way from being a life-saving medicine. What would it take for this obscure finding to be rediscovered and transformed from a laboratory curiosity into a weapon against disease and a quiet revolution in medicine? The quiet discovery of penicillin was left to languish for a decade. The Kaumpizonta world was at a precipice, on the brink of another global conflict. But the most important medical breakthrough of the century was sitting in a dusty journal. It would take a new team of scientists, working in a new location, to rediscover Fleming's work and turn it into a practical reality. That team was led by Howard Florey, a pathologist at Oxford University, and his brilliant young colleague, Ernst Chain. It was 1939, and the world was consumed by the looming threat of World War II. Florey and Chain, a meticulous and pragmatic duo, were not looking for a new wonder drug. They were studying how bacteria were killed by natural substances. While reviewing the scientific literature, they came across Fleming's forgotten paper. Intrigued by his findings, they decided to try to isolate and purify the penicillin juice that Fleming had found so difficult to work with. Their initial efforts were painstaking and slow. They were working with tiny amounts of the substance, and it was incredibly unstable. Their lab was not a sleek, modern facility. It was a small, underfunded space, and they used repurposed equipment, including milk churns and bedpans to grow the mold. The work was a testament to quiet, methodical persistence, a daily grind of trial and error. The team's big breakthrough came when they figured out a way to produce a stable, powdered form of penicillin. They had finally isolated the active substance, a feat that had eluded Fleming for a decade. Now the real challenge began, testing it on living subjects. The first test was on a small group of mice that had been infected with a deadly bacteria. The results were dramatic. The mice that received penicillin survived, while the others died. It was a clear, unambiguous success. The next step was to test it on a human. The first human test was on a London policeman named Albert Alexander, who was suffering from a severe infection that was about to kill him. The team gave him a dose of penicillin, and within days, his condition began to improve dramatically. But they had a problem. They didn't have enough penicillin to complete the treatment. The process of producing the drug was still incredibly slow and inefficient, and the team ran out of the drug before Alexander could be fully cured. The infection returned, and he died. It was a tragic failure, but it was also a profound lesson. Penicillin worked, and the only thing that stood between it and the lives of millions was the ability to produce it in vast quantities. The war had now fully engulfed the world, and the need for a drug that could treat battlefield infections was urgent. The Oxford team, recognizing the immense potential of their discovery, knew they couldn't scale up production on their own. They made a quiet but world-changing decision. They would travel to the United States to find a partner who could. What happened in the backrooms of American pharmaceutical companies, and how did a quiet, humble mold become a weapon that would change the course of a global war? The journey of penicillin from a quiet lab discovery to a mass-produced drug was a race against time. Florey and Chain, along with their colleague Norman Heatley, arrived in the United States in the summer of 1941, seeking help from American pharmaceutical companies. The American companies, initially skeptical, were quickly convinced of penicillin's potential. The challenge was immense. At the time, they were still using the same cumbersome methods as the Oxford team, growing the mold in small, individual containers. To produce enough penicillin to treat a single soldier, they would have needed a 1,000-gallon tank. This was not a problem of chemistry, but of industrial-scale production, a seemingly boring problem of logistics that would in fact win the war. The solution came from a team of scientists at the USDA's Northern Regional Research Laboratory in Peoria, Illinois. They were tasked with a single crucial mission: to find a way to mass-produce penicillin. The team, led by Andrew J. Moyer, discovered that a common household substance, corn steep liquor, a byproduct of corn wet milling, was an excellent food source for the mold. This simple discovery increased the penicillin yield by a factor of 10. They also found a new, more efficient strain of penicillium, found on a rotting cantaloupe at a local market. These two mundane discoveries, a better food source and a better MOLD strain, were the keys to unlocking the industrial-scale production of penicillin. The American pharmaceutical companies, with the help of the government, began to work together in an unprecedented collaboration. They shared their findings, and production facilities were built across the country. The work was tireless, and by the time of the D-Day landings in 1944, there was enough penicillin to treat every single-eyed soldier who needed it. Penicillin became a quiet but powerful weapon of war. It saved countless lives, not just from battlefield wounds, but from infections that had, for centuries, been a death sentence. It was a silent, unheralded revolution that changed the course of modern medicine forever. The legacy of penicillin is not just in the lives it saved, but in the way it changed our relationship with disease. Before penicillin, a simple cut could be fatal, and a pneumonia diagnosis was a terrifying prospect. Penicillin transformed these threats into treatable conditions. It was the first of many antibiotics, and it ushered in a new era of medical science. The story of penicillin reminds us that the most significant discoveries are often not the result of a single moment of genius, but of a long, quiet, and often boring process of trial and error, of a series of accidental events, and of the tireless work of countless individuals who believed in the power of a simple idea. The world we live in, one where a minor infection is no longer a death sentence, is a world that was quietly and profoundly shaped by a forgotten mold on a dirty Petri dish. History, as we often see it, is a tale of kings, battles, and monumental structures. Yet, beneath the grand narratives lies a more subtle, and arguably more important, story, the story of bureaucracy. Before the epic poems and the glorious monuments, there was a quiet revolution happening in the scribal offices of ancient Mesopotamia. The invention of writing, a tool we take for granted today, was not created to record great deeds or philosophical ideas. It was created for the most boring and mundane of reasons, to keep track of goods. The world's first system of writing, cuneiform, was born from the need to manage the vast and complex economic life of the world's first cities, particularly the Sumerian city-states like Uruk and Lagash. The Sumerian economy was not a free market in the modern sense. It was a highly centralized system managed by the temple and the palace. Farmers would bring their grain to a central storehouse, and artisans would contribute their goods to a common pool. This required an incredibly sophisticated system of accounting. How much grain was collected? How many sheep were given to the shepherd? Who received a ration of beer? These were the questions that faced the administrators of ancient Sumer. To answer them, they needed a system that was more reliable than human memory. They needed a way to record transactions that was permanent and unchangeable. The solution they found was both simple and ingenious. They used clay tablets and a stylus made from a reed. The scribes would press the wedge-shaped tip of the stylus into the soft clay, creating a series of marks. This was the birth of cuneiform, from the Latin cuneus meaning wedge and forma meaning shape. The marks were not a representation of a spoken language at first. They were pictograms, simple drawings of objects: a head of grain, a sheep, a jar of oil. This was the first step from a system of tokens to a system of abstract symbols. A small round token might represent 1 sheep, and a large one 10 sheep. But what if you had 100 sheep? You would need a bag of tokens. With cuneiform, you could simply draw 100 sheep on a single tablet dot. As the system evolved, the pictograms became more abstract, and the signs began to represent not just objects, but sounds. This was a crucial leap forward, a shift from a visual system to a phonetic one. This new, more flexible system allowed scribes to record not just transactions, but also administrative decrees, laws, and even letters. The clay tablet was a perfect medium for this work. It was cheap, readily available, and once dried in the sun or baked in a kiln, incredibly durable. Thousands of these tablets, dating back over 5,000 years, have been unearthed by archaeologists, and they provide a quiet, unglamorous record of a civilization that was built on the power of the spreadsheet. The world's first writers were not poets or philosophers. They were accountants and bureaucrats. Their work was meticulous, repetitive, and profoundly boring. They spent their days in small, dusty offices, carefully pressing their styluses into soft clay. But in doing so, they created the very foundation of our modern world. They created a system that allowed for the management of large-scale societies, for the accurate tracking of resources, and for the creation of a permanent record of human activity. What was it like, then, to be a scribe in this early bureaucracy? What were the challenges, the frustrations, and the quiet triumphs of a life lived from clay to code? The life of a scribe in ancient Sumer was a quiet, disciplined existence. The work was not a matter of inspiration, but of meticulous repetitive labor. A student at a scribal school, or Edaba, would spend years learning the thousands of cuneiform signs. The training was rigorous and often brutal, and only a small fraction of students, almost exclusively male and from wealthy families, would make it through. Their lessons were not in creative writing, but in the mundane details of daily life. How to write a receipt for a bushel of grain, how to calculate the rations for a work crew, and how to draft a legal contract. The scribes were the backbone of the Sumerian economy and the keepers of a new, powerful kind of knowledge. The scribe's day was a cycle of routine. They would sit on a mat on the floor, their tablet on their lap, and work from dawn to dusk. The tools were simple, a reed stylus and a lump of wet clay. The clay was a perfect medium for the work. It was soft and pliable, allowing for quick corrections, but once dried in the sun, it became a permanent record. The scribe's work was a form of meditation, a repetitive act that required immense concentration. A single slip of the hand could ruin a tablet, and a single mistake could lead to a dispute over a contract or a miscalculation of a tax. The most boring, but perhaps most important, aspect of the scribe's job was the creation of administrative records. These were not just lists of numbers. They were a form of social control. They allowed the temple and the palace to track every aspect of a person's life, from the taxes they paid to the rations they received. The records were used to manage the labor force, to organize the construction of public works, and to ensure that the city's resources were distributed efficiently. This system of record keeping was so effective that it was adopted by every major civilization in the ancient Near East, from the Akkadians to the Assyrians and the Babylonians. The boring act of writing on a clay tablet was in effect the invention of the spreadsheet. The scribe was more than just a record keeper. They were also the drafters of the world's first laws. The famous Code of Hammurabi, a set of laws from a later Babylonian period, was written in cuneiform. It was a testament to the power of writing to create a permanent, unchangeable body of law. The scribe's work in recording these laws in a quiet, methodical way was what made the concept of justice, as we understand it, possible. But the sheer volume of these administrative records created a new and very modern problem: data management. The scribes of ancient Sumer were producing thousands of tablets a year, and they needed a way to store and retrieve them. How did a scribe find a specific contract from 1,000 others? And what happened when a tablet, the sole record of a person's life, was lost or destroyed? The scribes of ancient Sumer, in their quiet, repetitive work, faced a problem that we still struggle with today: data retrieval and storage. The sheer volume of clay tablets produced by the bureaucracy of a major city-state was staggering. A single transaction, a contract for the sale of a field, a receipt for a bushel of grain could be recorded on a single tablet. Over years, this would amount to thousands of tablets, and the challenge was to organize and store them in a way that made them accessible. The solution was as simple as it was brilliant. The scribes organized the tablets by topic, date, and location. They would store them in open baskets or on shelves, and they would often tag them with a small label that described the contents. These were the world's first archives or libraries, and they were the backbone of the Sumerian administrative system. The quiet, repetitive act of organizing these tablets, of ensuring that the records of a civilization were kept safe and in order, was what made the grand projects of the ancient world possible. A king could not plan a military campaign or a public works project without knowing how many resources he had, and the scribes, with their carefully organized archives, were the ones who held that information. But the permanence of clay was also a vulnerability. A single tablet could be lost or broken, and with it, the only record of a transaction or a legal decision could be gone forever. The archives themselves were not immune to natural disasters or the destruction of war. When a city was sacked, the archives were often burned or scattered, and the records of an entire civilization could be lost in a single day. This fragility of the written record, even one as durable as clay, was a constant, unspoken threat. Legacy of the Sumerian scribes is a powerful one. By inventing writing for the most boring and mundane of reasons, they created the foundation for all the great intellectual achievements that followed. They were the anonymous, silent workers who made it possible for a society to manage its resources, to create a system of laws, and to pass down its knowledge from one generation to the next. The administrative records they left behind are not as dramatic as the epic poems or the grand monuments, but they are a far more valuable window into the daily life of a civilization. They tell a story of a world that was built on the quiet, unglamorous power of the written word, a world that was, in a very real sense, a spreadsheet on a clay tablet. The history of bureaucracy, then, is not a story of boring details. It is the story of how we learned to manage the complex world we created. The mariner's compass is one of the most transformative inventions in history, a device so simple and profound that it changed the course of global exploration and trade. Yet for centuries, its adoption was slow, its workings were shrouded in mystery, and its journey from a quiet scientific curiosity to a tool of immense power was a long, mundane, and unheralded process. The compass's secret was not just its ability to point north, but its quiet revolution in a world where navigation was a matter of guesswork and faith. Before the compass, sailors relied on the sailing directions of coastal navigation, which was a system based on landmarks, currents, and the position of the sun and stars. This worked well enough for journeys along a coastline, but it was useless for long voyages across the open ocean, where there were no visible landmarks. The ability to travel out of sight of land was a monumental challenge, and it was a barrier that stood in the way of global trade and exploration. The compass, a seemingly simple device, would quietly dismantle this barrier. The earliest references to a magnetic compass come from China around the 11th century. It was not a tool for navigation at first, but for geomancy, the art of divining a good location for a building or a tomb. The device was a simple magnetic needle or a piece of magnetite, an iron ore, floating in a bowl of water. It was a curiosity, a tool for a specific, esoteric purpose, and its navigational potential was not immediately recognized as the compass made its way to the Arab world, where it was adopted by merchants and sailors. They used it as a backup to celestial navigation, a tool to use on cloudy days when the stars were hidden. It was not a primary navigational tool, but a simple, practical aid. It was a tool for the boring, mundane reality of daily travel, a way to stay on course on a day. When the sun was hidden, the compass was not an instant sensation in Europe either. It arrived in the 12th century, and its use was met with suspicion. Sailors were a superstitious lot, and the idea of a needle that moved on its own, seemingly by magic, was met with fear and distrust. Many believed it was the work of the devil. The compass, for all its revolutionary potential, was just another tool in the sailor's arsenal. It was a slow, quiet journey from a magical curiosity to an accepted, trusted tool. But what was the secret of the compass's success? It wasn't the device itself, but the slow, patient process of understanding a force that was invisible to the human eye. What was the quiet, hidden power that made the compass so reliable, and how did a handful of curious scientists begin to understand it? The secret of the compass's reliability was not magic, but a phenomenon that was entirely invisible to the naked eye: magnetism. While the Chinese and Arab sailors had a practical understanding of the compass, they did not have a theoretical understanding of the force that made it work. This would change with a series of quiet, methodical experiments conducted in Europe. The first to truly investigate magnetism was the English scientist William Gilbert. His book, De Magnete, published in 1600, was the first major scientific work on the topic. Gilbert used a spherical piece of lodestone, a naturally magnetized rock, and a small magnetic needle to demonstrate that the Earth itself was a giant magnet. This was a profound and quiet leap forward in human understanding. He was, in effect, demystifying a force that had, for centuries, been shrouded in superstition. Gilbert's work was the foundation for a new kind of navigation, one that was based not on magic, but on a predictable scientific principle. The compass, once a simple aid, was now a tool for a new kind of scientific exploration. It was used to map the Earth's magnetic fields and to understand the subtle variations in the needle's direction. The compass's needle, it turned out, did not point to the geographic North Pole, but to a magnetic pole that was located elsewhere. This phenomenon, known as magnetic declination, was a quiet, almost imperceptible problem that navigators had. To account for the compass was also a tool for a new kind of global trade. The ability to travel reliably across the open ocean, without a reliance on coastal landmarks or celestial navigation, meant that new trade routes could be established. The spice trade, which had for centuries been a dangerous and expensive overland journey, could now be done by sea. The compass made it possible for merchants to travel farther, faster, and more safely. It was the quiet, unheralded engine that powered the age of exploration.